Mikhail Gorbachev joins hands with Pope John Paul, but the Pope keeps pressing for religious freedom. President Bush sends U.S. warplanes to help put down a coup in the Philippines and gets ready for the summit at sea. This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting tonight from Malta. Good evening. Malta, this tiny rock of history and romance, is ready tonight to play its part in the new superpower drama. George Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, one-on-one in a summit meeting of confrontation and cooperation. The two leaders trying to form a new relationship that could change the world. Just out here, the two naval vessels on which they will meet. This one, the USS Belknap, and over here, the Soviet cruiser Slava. Aboard his headquarters ship, the Belknap, President Bush was staying abreast, minute by minute, of events in the Philippines. Gorbachev flew in here tonight from Italy, and fresh from a different kind of summit. His meeting with the Pope, two realms of existence, negotiating in the Vatican. Gorbachev came a long way to the Vatican for his handshake with Pope John Paul II. But not far enough, it turned out, to win any immediate return visit from the pontiff. The Pope greeted Gorbachev in Russia, and the two men talked alone for more than an hour, well past the scheduled time. They announced an agreement to establish diplomatic relations between the Kremlin and the Holy See, not necessarily at the ambassadorial level. But the Pope stressed that Catholics in the Soviet Union are still waiting for full religious freedom. He said millions are hoping that the law on religious freedom, soon to be discussed by the Soviet legislature, will guarantee that right to all believers. Gorbachev said the law will be adopted soon. He said today's talks had consecrated the dialogue between the Kremlin and the Holy See, and he ended by departing from his script and noting that they had discussed a papal visit to Moscow. A Vatican spokesman later confirmed they had discussed it, but, he said, the Pope could not accept the invitation, at least not now, and would not until conditions have improved for the Church. Later, Gorbachev went on to Milan, Italy's business capital, where he got the most tumultuous reception of his tour. He told the mayor he was taken aback by the disorder, but he found it, quote, truly excellent and extraordinary. Later at a news conference, he turned to the changes in Eastern Europe, warning the West against trying to exploit the trend away from one-party rule. He said, in the past, some people accused the Soviet Union of exporting revolution, but now, if someone tries to export something else from the other side, I think that would be equally dangerous. That message was clearly aimed at his summit partner, George Bush. Gorbachev arrived in Malta late this evening and boarded a Soviet cruise ship in the harbor. The summit at sea begins in the morning. On his way here today, President Bush had to split his attention between preparing for the summit and dealing with an apparently unsuccessful attempt to overthrow the government of the Philippines. We'll have the full story on the Philippines later. Right now, Leslie Stahl is here to tell us about the president's journey. Leslie?
Well, Dan, the president was a little bit distracted by the Philippine coup attempt. While he came over here on Air Force One, he ordered air cover at Mrs. Aquino's request. But that coup has apparently failed, and now the president is turning his attention fully to the big event, the summit.
Attention on deck.
Just one day before he meets with Soviet leader Gorbachev to talk peace and the prospect of a new world order, the president boarded an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean and showed off American war-making muscle.
Lasting peace stems from strength that is moral and intellectual, economic, and military.
But some administration officials believe that the U.S. influence in the world is actually diminishing. And Mr. Bush himself sees the U.S. less as the leader of the West than a partner, less a crusader for reform than a cautious observer.
People have generally been disappointed at the fact that he couldn't even smile when the Berlin Wall came down, that he hasn't been able to identify himself with this spirit of change and joy.
Expectations are high that Mr. Bush will be bolder here, liberalizing trade with the Soviets, maybe even helping them take part in Western trade agreements, trying to boost Gorbachev at home.
Everybody understands that the president is going there not just to discuss issues, but to offer the president his explicit endorsement.
Of Gorbachev.
Of Gorbachev.
But the central issue at the summit will be Eastern Europe, whether the superpowers can together manage the rapid changes.
You have a Gorbachev who is a man who does see the world in a complex way, who is not wedded to this old East-West confrontation. And unfortunately,
and you think Bush is wedded?
I think so far he has shown himself to be. It may be that he'll change, he'll grow, or people grow in this office, but that remains to be seen.
Eastern Europe is moving like a raging bull at a speed no one on earth anticipated. Mr. Bush and Mr. Gorbachev are like two men at a rodeo. The key question is, can they stay on the bull, ride him and tame him, or are the superpowers powerful enough to control events that are moving so rapidly? Dan?
Thanks, Leslie. Still to come on your CBS Evening News, full coverage of the apparently failed coup in the Philippines, and correspondent Bob Simon on the mystique of Malta. The latest now about that coup attempt in the Philippines. Rebel troops trying to topple President Corazon Aquino's government reportedly fled their last strongholds in Manila tonight. This happened hours after President Bush ordered U.S. warplanes into the skies over Manila, apparently preventing any more rebel airstrikes on the presidential palace or on forces on the ground loyal to Aquino. From Manila, CBS Newsman Gabby Tabernar begins our coverage of the rebels' retreat.
They abandoned the positions they had occupied a day before.
I am appealing to the soldiers to lay down their arms and to put an end to this slaughter.
Once again, President Corazon Aquino has survived another takeover attempt. 12 hours earlier, rebels and government troops fought it out in several key sections of the city, sniping oftentimes almost at random. In this case, a man was shot at even as he was being evacuated in a stretcher. One skirmish was less than 3 miles from the presidential palace. At one point, the rebels brought the palace as well as 2 military garrisons under aerial attack. At around midday, U.S. warplanes made a dramatic appearance over Manila in support of Mrs. Aquino. By nightfall, when the jets returned to Clark Air Base north of Manila, the rebel withdrawal started, thus ending the 6th and most serious challenge against President Aquino since she took over nearly 4 years ago. Gabby Tabernar, CBS News, Manila.
The rebel air attack on the presidential palace was the high watermark of the coup attempt and the trigger for U.S. intervention.
The thing that the Aquino government was having difficulty dealing with were the air attacks.
For Corazon Aquino, the outlook was grim.
We did not have the capability to address the forces in the air and also down in the ground.
There were rebel forces in at least 5 sites in the city of Manila. The rebels targeted military installations, Air Force headquarters, the airport, and radio and TV stations.
The U.S. Navy placed a helicopter on alert to evacuate Mrs. Aquino. 100 Marines were flown in by helicopter to beef up security at the American embassy. A mammoth force waited in the wings, 2 aircraft carriers off the coast and a Marine amphibious group en route. But the U.S. wanted to use as little force as possible. F-4 jet fighters were launched from Clark Air Force Base. Rebel aircraft were warned they would be fired upon if they attempted to take off. That cleared the skies without firing a shot.
The order that the president signed out authorized U.S. forces to assist in securing the airbase or airspace over Manila without force if possible, with force if required.
Leading Democrats could find no fault with that.
He realized that if those Air Force units had been able to get airborne, that it could have toppled the government. He moved in a way to pin down those units on the ground and keep them from being effective.
The president's decision was an appropriate and prudent one under the circumstances, and in retrospect was obviously successful.
The CIA warned the Pentagon the morale and fighting power of the forces loyal to Aquino were low. This time, the Pentagon was able to save her without bloodshed. But the fact that she had to call on the U.S. will damage her image at home and increase the likelihood there will be a next time. David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon.
The ceasefire that allowed more than 200 U.S. citizens to escape El Salvador's civil war yesterday is over. A Salvadoran news photographer was killed today as fighting resumed between government soldiers and leftist rebels. Correspondent Juan Vasquez in San Salvador has the latest on the war in which guerrilla forces, at least to a certain extent, appear to be calling the shots.
The Army found itself back in the working-class neighborhood of Soyapango today as the guerrillas once again changed tactics. They returned to the original site of the offensive they launched in the capital 3 weeks ago, forcing the Army to fight when and where the rebels choose. Since the current round of fighting began, the guerrillas have been able to keep the armed forces off balance, choosing their targets, holding their ground for brief periods, then withdrawing without the fear of being hunted down by the armed forces. President Alfredo Cristiani today conceded that the Army is not chasing the rebels.
The armed forces are basically in a situation to preserve the security of the capital city and other large cities.
Meanwhile, on the other side of town, the guerrillas retreated from upper-class Escalon and the Army confidently moved in. But the damage has been done. Throughout nearly 10 years of civil war, few in this neighborhood had seen the war close up. Now their homes bear the scars of combat, and well-armed troops are a common sight on the once quiet streets. We think the guerrillas are coming back, said a weary soldier. The armed forces have been reluctant to use heavy weapons and air support to dislodge the rebels here for fear of destroying the homes of the wealthy. The guerrillas have been able to keep the initiative by striking with surprise and withdrawing swiftly, but the Army remains in control thanks to its overwhelming firepower and manpower. The military stalemate that has prevailed in El Salvador for years continues. Juan Vasquez, CBS News, San Salvador.
Former Finance Minister V.P. Singh was named Prime Minister of India today. He succeeds Rajiv Gandhi, whose Congress party lost its ruling majority in parliamentary elections last month. Singh and his National Front coalition now have 30 days to win a vote of confidence. In Washington today, the government reported that its chief forecasting gauge for the economy fell 0.4% for the month of October. That's the fifth time this so-called index of leading indicators has dropped in the 10 months of this year. Many analysts expected the October decline, which was marked by an increased demand for jobless insurance and a decrease in factory employees' average work week. As President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev get ready to discuss the historic reforms in Eastern Europe, there was another major change today. The parliament in East Germany officially ended the Communist Party's monopoly on power in that country. Correspondent Alan Pizzi reports on the latest victory for the freedom and democracy movement.
The handful of demonstrators didn't know it, but the politicians they were meeting were on their way to abolish the Communist Party's right to control East Germany. Parliament today erased the part of East Germany's constitution which gave the Communist Party dominance. The action met one of the main demands of the unofficial opposition. But the cutting edge of the protest movement seems to have been dulled by success.
I don't know if we necessarily want to take power as an alternative. I don't think we're ready for that by a long chalk. That's going to take a long time.
The New Forum Group is putting out its second edition of a self-published newspaper. Born barely 2 months ago in small apartments and made up primarily of intellectuals, New Forum is still trying to define itself. Some supporters don't think they should even become a political party. None of the 7 opposition groups has a single dynamic leader.
You can't just pull Gorbachev out of a hat, can you?
The ecology-minded Greens, meeting here with their West German counterparts, freely admit that they have no idea how to go about organizing themselves as a political force.
That we are standing side by side of all new democratic forces which are fight for democracy and freedom in our country, in the GDR.
That fight began in the churches, the only place where government opponents could meet safely. There are places like Leipzig where huge demonstrations have continued. But many in government and opposition are afraid they may be getting out of hand, with calls for reunification with West Germany, which would nullify the socialism that both opposition and government say they want to rebuild. Communist Party leader Egon Krenz is to meet opposition groups next week to discuss political reforms that would meet demands for change, but still maintain East Germany's socialist system. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, East Berlin.
Flying on a Pan Am jet named the Liberty Bell, Olympic gymnast Nadia Comaneci arrived in New York today after defecting from her native Romania. The 28-year-old Comaneci requested and was granted refugee status in this country before taking off from Vienna. She has won 21 gold medals in competition since she first dazzled the world as an 86-pound 14-year-old in the 1976 Olympics, where she became the first gymnast ever to score a perfect 10. Alvin Ailey, a legendary figure in the world of dance, died today of a blood disorder in a New York hospital. Ailey was 58. He had gained a worldwide reputation for fusing black and white dance techniques. Newsman Bill Stout died today at 62 in Los Angeles, a town he covered for 39 years, most of it for CBS News and station KCBS. Stout was a gruff, witty man, a curmudgeon. He was also a great writer and reporter. He did everything well, did it a long time, and with a kind of hard-bitten joy. He was a legend in this business, and he deserved to be. Bill Stout. On the eve of the Superpower Summit, Mikhail Gorbachev is in a foreign land, but in familiar territory at the center of international attention. Moscow correspondent Mark Phillips reports on how the Soviet leader's starring role on the world stage is playing back home.
While Mikhail Gorbachev was being warmly received at the Vatican, Muscovites were doing what they usually do, standing in the cold, waiting to buy something. They may have been warmed today by the music of Raisa Alexandrovna, but their own refrain was that meetings with popes and presidents in far-off lands do nothing to improve the ever-worsening conditions at home. There's nothing in the shops, she says. What Gorbachev does over there does nothing for the little people. The Russians have gotten used to seeing Gorbachev in the world limelight, and this trip has been given the usual blanket coverage. Yet despite the cynicism of many, Gorbachev's promise of international cooperation and of religious freedom at home is being watched closely, particularly by the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church, which has recently moderated its centuries-old hostility toward Ukrainian Catholicism.
Yes, I am happy because it's the very important part of common efforts for new world, for common world.
However important today's encounter at the Vatican was, in Soviet eyes, the main event in this trip is still to come, and they're looking to President Bush to join them in their declared less involved approach to Eastern Europe.
We want some assurances that the countries involved will be able to settle their affairs as they want to, without interference either from the West or from the East.
This summit will be played out against the backdrop of Moscow's growing intellectual freedom and continuing economic hardship. As Raisa Alexandrovna, the accordionist, says, things are hard here, but Gorbachev is bringing us peace. That makes everything else okay. Mark Phillips, CBS News, Moscow.
Joining me now is CBS News correspondent Bob Simon, who's been looking around this storied island of Malta for the last couple of weeks.
Dan, we're in the grand hall here of Malta's old palace. It was once the barracks of the Knights of Malta. They were given this island in the 16th century by the King of Spain for the rent of 1 falcon a year.
Well, most Americans have never been to Malta, and many can't find it on the map, but they do know about that falcon.
Humphrey Bogart made sure of that.
What do you know, sir, about the order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, later known as the Knights of Rhodes and other things?
Crusaders or something, weren't they?
The island fortress, which those crusaders called home for 2.5 centuries, is a place in the sun for British tourists now, and that legendary Maltese falcon, a curio shop, from Bogart to postcards. The island's honeycomb-colored cathedrals, built not long after the Crusades, recall the last time Europe was united, not by a common market, but by a common Catholicism. The Knights were defenders of the faith, defenders of Europe, which were the same thing. But the strip of water between here and Italy never protected Malta from the traumas of Europe. During the Second World War, the German Luftwaffe reduced much of the island to rubble. The London Blitz paled by comparison. In 1945, Roosevelt and Churchill met here to cook up their plans for a free post-war Europe before serving them up to Stalin in Yalta. That summit set the stage for the division of Europe, for the Cold War and the Berlin Wall. It's perhaps simply because Malta sounds so much like Yalta that some people are afraid.
Well, I'm afraid a little bit they are going to cut the cake with the name Europe. Now we will see on which path we are going to be. But I hope it won't be second Yalta.
It can't be. That's what's changed between Yalta and Malta. The leaders are no longer in control. History has left them at sea. All the presidents can really do is recognize the new realities dictated not by Marxist laws of history, but by people who've decided to step outside them.
I hope that the summit in Malta will be the first steps towards the undoing of what, in fact, Yalta has brought about.
Malta, the perpetual outsider, the sun-baked dot somewhere between Sicily and Tripoli, forever watching empires rise and fall, now bearing witness to the demise of an old order, to the rebirth of a dream which died at Yalta, a united Europe, free and democratic.
What is it?
The stuff that dreams are made of.
Huh? But there's going to be a cold reality on that ship tomorrow. Even world leaders, it would seem, can no longer make history. All they can really do is try to cope with history in the making.
Thanks, Bob. And that's part of our world tonight. Dan Rather reporting from the Palace of the Knights of Malta. We'll be here all weekend with our regular evening newscasts, Saturday night with Connie Chung, Sunday morning with Charles Kuralt, and special reports to keep you up to date as this summit unfolds. See you as we go along. Good night.
This is CBS.